What if I told you that America's most famous traitor was actually the man who saved the entire revolution? That Benedict Arnold, yes, that Benedict Arnold pulled off the most crucial victory in American history, and without him, you might be singing God Save the King right now instead of the Star-Spangled Banner. Stick around, because this story is going to flip everything you think you know about the founding of America on its head. Welcome back to Liberty Unfolded, where we dig deep into the stories that shaped our freedom. I'm your host, and today we're talking about one of history's most mind-bending paradoxes, how Benedict Arnold, the man whose name became synonymous with betrayal, actually delivered the victory that saved the American Revolution. This isn't the Benedict Arnold story you learned in school. This is the story of a brilliant military commander, a man pushed to his breaking point, and a battle that literally changed the fate of the world. So grab your coffee, hit that subscribe button, and let's dive into one of the most incredible stories in American history. It's October 1777, and the American Revolution is hanging by a thread. The British have a master plan. They're going to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies by controlling the Hudson River Valley. If they succeed, it's game over. The rebellion dies, and America becomes just another footnote in British colonial history. Leading this British offensive is General John Burgoyne, a flashy, overconfident commander who's so sure of victory that he's literally brought champagne to celebrate. This guy was known back in London for his gambling, his affairs, and his arrogance. He called the American forces a rabble in arms, and boasted that he would make them all prisoners of war. Burgoyne was leading over 7,000 professional soldiers, including feared Hessian mercenaries and Native American allies. These weren't colonial militia, these were battle-hardened killers who had crushed rebellions across the British Empire. Meanwhile, the Continental Army is a mess. They're low on supplies, morale is in the gutter, and many of the soldiers haven't been paid in months. Picture men wearing blankets for coats, with holes in their shoes so big you could see their bare feet. Some units were down to eating leather and tree bark. Desertion was rampant every morning. Commanders would wake up to find fewer men than the night before. The Continental Congress was broke, begging for loans from anyone who would listen. George Washington himself was writing desperate letters, wondering if the cause was lost. European observers were placing bets on how quickly the rebellion would collapse. The French, Spanish, and Dutch, all potential allies, were watching and waiting, but none wanted to back a losing horse. If the British succeeded in splitting the colonies, the psychological impact would be devastating. It would prove that professional European armies could crush any colonial uprising, effectively ending the age of revolution before it truly began. But here's where it gets interesting. The American forces have something the British don't expect: Benedict Arnold. And this wasn't just any general, this was a man who had already become a legend for his impossible victories and his willingness to attempt what others considered suicidal. Now, before Arnold became America's most hated traitor, he was America's most brilliant general. This guy was fearless, and I mean absolutely fearless. He'd already led the failed but heroic assault on Quebec, where he took a bullet to the leg but kept fighting. He'd built a fleet from scratch on Lake Champlain, and even in defeat, delayed the British advance by an entire year. But here's what most people don't know: Arnold was broke. He'd spent his own fortune funding his troops, and Congress kept overlooking him for promotions. Imagine being the best at your job, sacrificing everything, and watching less qualified people get promoted over you. That's Benedict Arnold in 1777. Arnold had started the war as a successful merchant and ship captain from Connecticut. He owned ships, had money in the bank, and lived comfortably. But when the revolution began, he didn't just offer his services, he offered his wallet. He personally funded entire military expeditions, bought supplies for his men out of his own pocket, and even paid soldiers' wages when Congress couldn't. By 1777, he was financially ruined. His businesses had collapsed, his ships were gone, and he was deep in debt. Yet despite his sacrifices, Congress kept promoting men with political connections over Arnold. Men who had never won a battle, never risked their fortunes, never bled for the cause. Arnold watched as incompetent generals got commands while he was passed over again and again. The frustration was eating him alive. Working alongside Arnold was a cast of characters that history has largely forgotten. There's Daniel Morgan, a tough-as, nails frontiersman who could put a musket ball through a playing card at 100 yards. This guy had been whipped 499 times by the British Army years earlier. They stopped at 499 because 500 lashes was considered a death sentence, and he had the scars to prove it. Morgan's back was a map of crisscrossed scars from that brutal punishment, and he wore them like badges of honor. He commanded a unit of riflemen from Virginia mountain men who could shoot the buttons off a man's coat at 300 yards. Then there's Enoch Poor, a shipbuilder from New Hampshire, who'd left his comfortable life to fight for liberty. Poor commanded New Hampshire troops who were so broke they were practically barefoot, but they fought like lions. These men had marched hundreds of miles from their home state, leaving behind families and businesses, knowing they might never return. They were farmers, carpenters, blacksmiths, ordinary men who had chosen to risk everything for an idea that most of the world thought was impossible. These men weren't politicians or philosophers debating in comfortable rooms. They were regular people who'd risked everything for an idea, that people should be free to govern themselves. They had mortgaged their futures, abandoned their careers, and left their families to fight for a principle that existed more in their hearts than in any law book. The First Battle of Saratoga happens on September 19th, 1777. It's a bloody stalemate, but Arnold sees something his cautious commander Horatio Gates doesn't: opportunity. Gates wants to sit tight and wait. He's got a defensive position, why risk it? But Arnold knows that in war, as in life, sometimes you have to take risks to win big. He begs Gates to let him attack, but Gates refuses and actually relieves Arnold of command. Here's where the human drama gets intense. Arnold is literally watching the fate of his country being decided, and he's been benched. Imagine being a star quarterback, watching your team lose the Super Bowl from the sidelines because your coach won't put you in the game. The tension between Gates and Arnold had been building for weeks. Gates was a political general. He knew how to work the system, how to take credit for victories, and how to avoid blame for defeats. He was cautious, methodical, and above all, he was jealous of Arnold's reputation. Gates had spent the first battle hiding in his tent, literally miles from the fighting, while Arnold had been on the front lines inspiring the troops. When the smoke cleared and the British had been bloodied but not beaten, Gates took credit for the victory, while privately seething that Arnold had stolen the spotlight. So Gates did what petty commanders have done throughout history. He removed his rival from the equation. He stripped Arnold of his command and essentially confined him to camp. Arnold was devastated. This wasn't just about military strategy. This was about watching everything he'd fought for potentially slip away because of one man's ego. But Arnold doesn't give up. On October 7th, when the second battle begins, he defies orders and charges into the fight anyway. Picture this scene: Arnold, mounted on a massive brown horse, galloping across the battlefield like something out of a movie. He's rallying troops, directing attacks, and turning the tide of battle through sheer force of will. The soldiers see him coming and their spirits soar. This is the general who had led them to victory after victory, who had shared their hardships and their dangers. When Arnold appears on the battlefield, men who were ready to retreat suddenly find the courage to charge. Units that had been wavering suddenly stand firm. It's like watching a spark ignite a powder keg. Daniel Morgan's riflemen are picking off British officers with deadly precision. These frontier sharpshooters are using a new tactic. Instead of firing at the mass of soldiers, they're targeting officers, sergeants, anyone who looks like they're giving orders. The British Army depends on rigid discipline and clear command structure, and Morgan's men are systematically destroying both. Enoch Poor's New Hampshire boys are fighting with desperate courage. These men know they're facing professional soldiers who consider them rebels and traitors. If they lose, there will be no prisoner exchanges, no honorable surrender. They're fighting for their lives and their families' futures. But it's Arnold who's everywhere at once, plugging gaps in the line, leading charges, inspiring men to fight beyond their limits. He's not just commanding, he's fighting alongside his men, sharing their risks, proving that their cause is worth dying for. The British are falling back, but they've taken refuge in a fortified redoubt. It's like a miniature fortress, bristling with cannons and defended by elite troops. Taking it seems impossible, a frontal assault would be suicide. But Arnold, in a moment of either brilliance or madness, leads a direct assault. His horse is shot out from under him, and the same leg that was wounded at Quebec gets shattered by a musket ball. As Arnold lies there, bleeding and possibly dying, American forces overrun the British position. The battle is won, but the cost is personal and devastating. Arnold's military career is effectively over. His leg will never heal properly, leaving him with a permanent limp and constant pain. Here's why this matters so much. Saratoga wasn't just another battle. It was the moment that convinced France to join the war on America's side. The French had been watching, waiting to see if these American rebels could actually fight. When news of Saratoga reached Paris, everything changed. Benjamin Franklin, who was in France trying to secure an alliance, later said that Arnold's victory at Saratoga was the key that unlocked French support. Without France's navy, money, and military expertise, the revolution would have failed. It's that simple. The victory at Saratoga sent shockwaves across Europe. For the first time, a colonial rebellion had defeated a major European power in open battle. This wasn't guerrilla warfare or hit and run tactics. This was a decisive military victory that resulted in the surrender of an entire British army. European monarchs who had been dismissing the American rebellion as a temporary uprising suddenly had to take it seriously. In the French court at Versailles, the news of Saratoga was received with barely contained excitement. The French had been humiliated by the British in the 7 Years' War and were desperate for revenge. They had already been secretly providing supplies to the Americans, but now they could openly declare war on Britain without looking like they were backing a lost cause. The Spanish and Dutch, traditional enemies of Britain, began to reconsider their positions. If the Americans could actually win, then supporting them became a viable way to weaken British power. The victory at Saratoga transformed the American Revolution from a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. Think about the delegates back in Philadelphia, men like John Adams, who was writing letters to his wife Abigail about the uncertain future of their cause. These weren't just political debates. These were real people wrestling with whether their experiment in self-government would survive. Adams had been dealing with the constant stress of knowing that if they lost, they would all be hanged as traitors. The phrase, "we must all hang together, or we shall all hang separately," wasn't just a witty saying, it was a literal description of their situation. Samuel Adams, the firebrand from Boston, had staked everything on the idea that common people could govern themselves. This was a radical concept in 1777. Every government in the world was some form of monarchy or aristocracy. The idea that ordinary farmers and merchants could create a stable government seemed impossible to most educated observers. Samuel Adams had spent years organizing resistance to British rule. and he knew that failure would mean not just his own death, but the death of the entire concept of self-governance. Roger Sherman, a simple shoemaker from Connecticut, was helping write the Articles of Confederation while wondering if there would even be a country left to govern. Sherman represented the common man in Congress. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't aristocratic, he was just a skilled craftsman who believed in liberty. His presence in Congress was itself a revolutionary act, proving that in America, merit mattered more than birth. The victory at Saratoga gave these men hope. It proved that their cause wasn't just a pipe dream, it was achievable. For the first time since the Declaration of Independence, they could believe that they might actually create the nation they had envisioned. The psychological impact was enormous. Suddenly, recruitment became easier, loans became available, and international recognition became possible. But here's where the story gets heartbreaking. Benedict Arnold, the hero of Saratoga, never fully recovered from his wounds. He was passed over for promotion again. He was investigated by Congress for minor financial irregularities, while other officers got rich. He watched less capable men get the recognition he deserved. The man who saved the revolution felt abandoned by the very country he'd bled for. And that bitterness, that sense of betrayal, eventually led him to commit the ultimate betrayal himself. Arnold's recovery from his Saratoga wounds was agonizing. The same leg that had been wounded at Quebec was now shattered beyond repair. He spent months in bed, enduring primitive medical treatment that often did more harm than good. The pain was constant, and he walked with a severe limp for the rest of his life. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional wounds that were about to be inflicted. While Arnold was recovering, Congress was conducting business as usual, which meant politics, favoritism, and petty jealousies ruled the day. Men who had never risked their lives in battle were making decisions about military commands. Arnold watched as Horatio Gates, who had tried to take credit for Saratoga while hiding in his tent, was celebrated as a hero and given new commands. The financial investigations were particularly galling. Arnold had spent his personal fortune supporting the revolution, and now Congress was questioning every penny. They accused him of using his position for personal gain, even though he was broke and in debt from his service. Meanwhile, other officers were openly profiteering from the war, selling supplies on the black market and skimming money from soldiers' pay, but they had political connections that protected them. The final insult came when Arnold was assigned to command Philadelphia, not as a reward, but as what many saw as a dead-end posting. The city had been recently liberated from British occupation, and Arnold was essentially functioning as a military governor dealing with civilian complaints and administrative paperwork. For a man who had led cavalry charges and stormed enemy fortifications, it was a humiliating come-down. It was in Philadelphia that Arnold met Peggy Shippen, a young woman from a wealthy Loyalist family. Peggy was beautiful, sophisticated, and she had connections to British officers from the recent occupation. Through her, Arnold was introduced to a world of luxury and refinement that his military service had cost him. She also introduced him to the idea that maybe, just maybe, he had chosen the wrong side. The transformation wasn't immediate. Arnold struggled with his conscience for months. He had genuine patriotic feelings, and he knew that his victory at Saratoga had saved the revolution. But he also felt that the revolution had betrayed him. He had given everything and received nothing in return. Worse, he was watching incompetent political appointees destroy the cause he had fought for. It's a reminder that heroes are human. They have breaking points. They make mistakes. And sometimes the very qualities that make someone a great leader, pride, ambition, the need for recognition, can also be their downfall. Arnold's story is a cautionary tale about how even the greatest patriots can be driven to betrayal, when they feel their sacrifices have been ignored and their service has been unrewarded. The delegates Arnold saved went on to create something unprecedented in human history: a government based on the consent of the governed. The ideas they debated: individual liberty, limited government. The rule of law became the foundation of the modern world. When you vote, when you speak freely, when you practice your religion without fear, you're exercising rights that exist because Benedict Arnold charged across that battlefield at Saratoga. It's complicated, it's messy, and it's deeply human. The victory at Saratoga didn't just save the American Revolution, it launched a global revolution of ideas. The concept that ordinary people could govern themselves, that kings and nobles weren't divinely appointed to rule, that individual rights were more important than state power, these ideas spread from America to France, to Latin America, to eventually every corner of the globe. Consider what the world looked like in 1777. Every major nation was ruled by a monarch who claimed divine right to rule. The idea that a farmer or a shopkeeper could have a voice in government was considered not just radical, but literally insane. Social mobility was almost impossible. You were born into your class and you died in it. The very concept of equality before the law was revolutionary. The men who wrote our founding documents weren't perfect. They made compromises, they had blind spots, and yes, many of them owned slaves. But they also created a system that could evolve, that could expand the definition of liberty over time. The Constitution they wrote included mechanisms for change, for growth, for correction of injustices. Think about the ripple effects. The French Revolution was directly inspired by American success. Latin American independence movements in the 19th century looked to the American example. The abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, civil rights, all of these movements used the language and principles established by those delegates in Philadelphia. Even today, when people around the world demand democracy, when they protest against authoritarian regimes, when they insist on their right to free speech and free assembly, they're invoking principles that were preserved by Arnold's victory at Saratoga. The Arab Spring, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Solidarity movement in Poland, all of these movements drew inspiration from the American idea that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. The economic implications were equally revolutionary. The idea that individuals could own property, start businesses, and keep the profits from their labor created the foundation for capitalism and the modern economy. The prosperity we enjoy today, the technological advances, the medical breakthroughs, all of this is built on the economic freedom that was secured by military victory at places like Saratoga. But perhaps most importantly, the American Revolution established the principle that people have the right to change their government when it becomes destructive of their rights. This wasn't just about replacing one king with another, it was about creating a system where the people themselves were sovereign. It was about proving that ordinary human beings, with all their flaws and limitations, could create a just and stable society without the need for kings or nobles or priests to rule over them. So the next time someone tells you history is boring, remind them of this story. Remind them that our freedom was won by flawed human beings who made extraordinary sacrifices. Remind them that Benedict Arnold, America's greatest traitor, was also one of its greatest heroes. The liberty we enjoy today didn't come from perfect people making perfect decisions. It came from complicated human beings doing their best in impossible circumstances. And maybe that's the most American story of all. What do you think? Does knowing Arnold's heroism at Saratoga change how you view his later betrayal? Are heroes and villains really that different? Or are we all just people trying to do right by our own lights? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story surprised you as much as it surprised me when I first learned it, smash that like button and subscribe to Liberty Unfolded. We've got more incredible stories about the forgotten heroes and complicated characters who shaped our freedom. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the human stories behind American liberty. Because understanding our past isn't just about knowing what happened, it's about understanding ourselves. Thanks for watching, and remember, liberty isn't just something we inherited, it's something we have to choose every single day.